There has been much public uproar here in the nation about an appalling assault in Busan, in which a man attacked a woman on the ground floor of her apartment building with a turning kick to the back of her head. He kept battering her while she lay on the floor until she lost consciousness. He was a stranger and initially sentenced to 12 years by lower court for attempted murder. Then last week, the Busan High Court acknowledged charges of attempted sexual assault as well and sentenced him to 20 years. His identity has yet to be disclosed. So what is the current law regarding the disclosure of the identities of suspects? What are the changes being proposed by the government and ruling party? And what support mechanisms are necessary to promote healing for the victims? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. In a policy consultation meeting this past Sunday, the government and ruling People Power Party reached a broader consensus on disclosing the identities of brutal crime assailants. For more on this, I have Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University here in the studio. Professor Cho, it's been a while since we've had you here in person. Welcome back.
It's nice to be back in the studio.
Right. I also have Professor Susan Hess at the University of Southern California live on the line. Professor Hess, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Cho, we'll start here then. Let's begin with a few details, Professor, about the current law here in Korea regarding the disclosure of the identities of suspects. I understand 4 criteria have to be met and then be followed by a committee review. Am I right?
The current law regarding disclosing the identity of suspect is that in general it's prohibited, and it's only actually allowed in 2 special cases. One is where the suspect is suspected of having committed violent crime, and so there is a special law regarding the punishment of serious crimes, and that allows the disclosure of identity of a suspect as if the crime has been committed in an especially heinous way, and there is very clear evidence that the suspect is the one who committed the crime, and that it's in the public interest to make the disclosure of the identity, and the suspect is not a minor, that the person is over 19 years old, over 19 years. And there is also another case where sexual crimes have been committed, and so because crimes of sexual nature is considered by their character heinous, as long as you can prove that there is sufficient evidence to show that the suspect has committed a crime and he or she is not a minor and it's in public interest, then you can disclose the identity of the suspect. Otherwise, it's basically prohibited.
Right. But Professor Cho, am I right in claiming that some 20 years ago, though, the identities of these suspects were shared on television and the newspaper, in the media that is? What prompted the shift away from this practice?
You are absolutely right in that, up until 20 years ago, it was just free for all. The media would actually go to the house of the suspect and grab, graduation album of their high school and simply show the pictures in newspapers and broadcasts. They would disclose home address of the suspects, but the National Human Rights Commission became very concerned about this practice and decided to issue a guideline to say that identity of suspects should not be disclosed. And back in 2010, they actually amended these 2 particular laws regarding sexual crimes and serious crimes to allow disclosure just in those 2 special circumstances.
Right, I see. And before we proceed any further, Professor Hess, let's take some time now to understand perhaps the very difficult, of course, emotions that victims of violent crimes are initially forced to face. Could you walk us through these emotions?
Sure. So each person reacts differently to trauma, and there's no right or wrong way to feel. They actually may not want to talk about the violence, or they may want to talk about it all the time. They may question their religious beliefs or be angry at God. They may want to forgive the person who was violent, or they may want the person to spend the rest of their life in prison. If they knew the person, they may miss or long for that person, which is actually called trauma bonding. They may blame themselves, and they may experience depression, suicide attempts, post-traumatic stress disorder, other stress and anxiety disorders, sleeping or eating disorders, and a range of health implications.
And keeping that in mind, Professor Hess, how should families and friends, of course, seek to support these victims. I mean, what do you advise as they hope to better help their loved ones?
Yeah, so through a trauma-informed lens, you would want to follow 6 principles. So one is safety, creating a safety plan of ways to feel safe internally since we can't control the external. So healing the mind and the body, and in this situation, help from a professional would be really supportive. Trust and transparency. So try to listen and be present while refraining from judging their feelings, even if their feelings go against your feelings. Peer support and mutual self-help. So a peer support group could be supportive as it can create safety and hope, build trust, enhance collaboration, and utilize stories of lived experiences to promote healing. Collaboration, which means using power with versus power over the person, which is another form of collective healing, so that we're not alone and feeling just in our own silo. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So you can ask the person, would you like to talk, or would you like me to just be here with you? And silence is okay. And cultural, historical, and gender considerations. Policies must respond to the diverse needs of individuals by recognizing and addressing oppression, and individuals can do the same.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, moving forward, Professor Cho, do you believe social media in recent times is perhaps making it harder to hide the identities of assailants?
Definitely. You mentioned in the introduction that this Busan roundhouse or wheel kick assailant, his identity hasn't been disclosed. Officially, that's correct. His identity hasn't been disclosed by the police, but a YouTuber who investigates like crimes and so forth, he actually, the YouTuber actually took it upon himself to disclose the identity, and not only the identity, but prior criminal record of the assailant, his height, his blood type, name, address, face, pretty much every personal information that this YouTuber could collect regarding the assailant. Now, in that particular case, the victim actually requested the police for the identity to be disclosed, and technically, I think if the request had been made, and perhaps if it had happened while the assailant was still a suspect, the police might have made a decision to disclose the identity. But because he was no longer a suspect, but a defendant facing a trial, the law doesn't cover that, and so they couldn't disclose his identity.
Oh, I see. And keeping that in mind, the YouTuber, Professor Cho, what legal consequences is he poised to face given this breaking of the law by unilaterally sharing the identity of this man?
You know, we still have criminal defamation, and criminal defamation applies even where what he has disclosed is true. So unless the YouTuber can show that this was strictly in public interest that he made this disclosure, he could actually be criminally charged for defamation. The assailant himself could actually sue the YouTuber for disclosing his personal information for breach of his privacy and also for defamation, and could claim civil damages.
Right, I see. Professor Hess, what are the implications, perhaps, of making public the identities of suspects in terms of healing for victims?
Yeah, so not every person who's experienced violence would like to see the person who was violent plastered everywhere, especially if this was a known person, as there are often conflicting emotions, which goes back to the trauma bonding. And I believe it's important to think in terms of healing for all families, including the family of the person who was violent and the person who was violent, which is collective healing.
Professor Hess, what support mechanisms are in place, perhaps, where you are in California for victims of violent crimes?
Yeah, so we have national, state, and local organizations. So we have the National Center for Victims of Crime. We have the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And within Los Angeles, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office has a victim services department that provides crisis intervention, emergency assistance, counseling referrals, case status notification, court escort and orientation, and restitution assistance.
Would you say the support from the government is equally as strong?
Yes, 100% for the victims, yes.
Professor Cho, back here in Korea this past Sunday, the government and ruling party agreed to pave the path for the disclosure of identities of assailants of brutal crimes. What more can you tell us about this?
Certainly, the government and President himself has called upon wider disclosure of suspects of serious crimes, especially crimes against women. I believe what they propose are to essentially extend the scope of disclosure. So currently, the two laws that I mentioned earlier regarding serious crime and sexual crime, they only apply to suspects. Now, for sexual crimes, once you are convicted, so you are a convicted sex criminal, then you are registered automatically in a database. So it's a little bit like Megan's Law in the US, so that even after the convicted is released, their whereabouts can be known, and residents nearby can take whatever measures that they may feel necessary. But regarding other type of crimes, non-sexual crimes, that kind of database doesn't exist. So perhaps I'm just conjecturing here, but they may increase the scope to include not just suspects but defendants in a trial as well, so that this Busan kind of case where identity couldn't be disclosed because the suspect was no longer a suspect won't happen again, and perhaps also maintaining a database of serious criminals where the risk of recidivism is high. Those kind of things are what comes to mind, but they haven't really disclosed any further details yet.
Right, they're still talking about it. Professor Hess, on a personal level, where do you stand perhaps on the debate here in Korea regarding the disclosure of identities of suspects? Some say more should be done to fight gender-based violence instead of simply seeking to disclose the identities of the suspects. What do you say?
Yes, I tend to agree with South Korea not sharing the image of the person who committed the crime. I think it's important to think about the harm this could potentially do to both families, specifically the LGBTQIA community if the person was not out. I believe the importance of healing for both the person who is violent and their family, and the person who experienced the violence and their family receive support. And I really believe we need to dismantle how implicit bias impacts the social, political, and legal systems around this. Specifically oppression around race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, age, religion, gender identity, geography, country of origin, immigration status, all really impact individuals in the states.
Professor Cho, here, in quite a number of cases here in the country, the picture of assailants shared by the authorities, they stand in contrast with the actual appearances of these suspects. Should Korea seek to perhaps adopt the mugshot system of the US, do you think?
Do you know, many people don't realize that here in Korea, police also do take mugshots because they need to be able to identify the suspects. So once they're arrested and taken into custody, they do take mugshots, but they are not allowed to disclose those mugshots without the consent of the suspect. So this is why we don't see them. They are not just automatically made public like in the United States. The reason for this is because back in 1988, there was a Supreme Court decision which said that yes, the public has a right to know, but the right to know about crimes, but the right to know doesn't necessarily include the right to know about the identity of the criminal. Because that's not necessarily going to, unless the suspect is at large and, he's under, the police is actually seeking him, it's not going to help to catch him or anything. So typically the suspect is in custody of the police, and disclosure of that nature they didn't believe is necessary to prevent similar crimes being committed. And so the interpretation of the Justice Ministry is that you can't disclose identity, i.e. pictures, names, etc., without the consent of the suspect. And so this is why we have, typically these pictures of suspects in caps and face masks being led away by the police, or even in female cases, this curtain being made of hair and completely hiding their face. So I think once the police the committee has actually made a decision to disclose the identity of the suspect, then they should simply use the mugshot. I mean, it seems nonsensical that they should make the decision to disclose, but then not actually disclose what the suspect looks like currently.
You're right. Professor Hess, generally speaking, do you suppose harsher punishment may serve to deter rampant, heinous crimes against women?
Actually, the research consistently finds that punishment is ineffective and quite the opposite, as it demonstrates higher levels of aggression, violence, and depression. And, it really makes sense that a large number of individuals who have experienced the criminal legal system leave prison with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
Yeah, and one more thing, I'm thinking too, the American tax dollars should really be going towards healing versus incarceration, as the criminal legal system in the U.S. presents a clear case study in modern slavery.
Right, I see. And Professor Cho here in the studio, do you believe that harsher punishment, keeping in mind, of course, what Professor Hess just said, do you believe that harsher punishment here in the country may perhaps serve to deter crimes against women? There is talk about, some critics talking about how our punishment compared to the punishment imposed by those in other countries may be a bit more lenient.
I think our criminal justice system tend to award lenient sentences. They're not cumulative, but also parallel, which means that if you commit multiple crimes, they're not added onto, the sentences are not added on, but they're simply essentially averaged out. And so certainly compared to other countries, our punishment are somewhat weak, that they may not act as enough of a deterrence to would-be criminals. But at the same time, you need to find the root of the crimes that are being committed. And it's not necessarily always that, harsher punishment is going to deter people from committing crimes. If that were the case, having death penalty should deter everyone from, committing crime, but that's not the case.
Right, a valid point right there. Professor Hess, we have some time left, which is why I'm going to ask you a little bit about your entity, the Trauma-Informed LA, I believe. What was the basis or background behind the establishment or the founding of your entity?
That's such an interesting question from what we're talking about. So I worked in the field of domestic violence for about 20 years. And what I saw was that a lot of the domestic violence shelters were very oppressive for the women who were living in them. So we actually started, it was a group of 10 people in 2014, really wanting to change systems that are incredibly oppressive in the domestic violence arena. Then we recognized that many systems are experiencing oppression, and there is systemic racism in many of these systems. And now we have over 5,000 people who've been participating, which has been really powerful of how can we really raise up the community voice.
Right, I see. Professor Hess, do you believe there needs to be perhaps more education within the broader public to ensure better support frameworks for the victims of violent crimes?
I do. I think what would be really helpful is to ask the victims of the violent crimes what they need and where the gaps are, especially during the COVID time, especially with domestic violence shelters. There was no room. They were being placed in hotels and motels. And for example, a lot of women who are experiencing intimate partner violence have pets, and a lot of pets are not allowed in shelters. So then the women oftentimes choose to stay with the violence or to go to the streets.
Right, unfortunately, I see. Back here in Korea, Professor Cho, I was wondering, we talked about how this YouTuber sought to disclose the identity of the man in Busan who assaulted this lady. With regard to that particular case, there were reports about how the man, while in prison, chose to threaten the woman, sending her letters and talking about how he was going to get revenge once he was out.
Yes.
Are there no legal frameworks to better support the lady in question?
In terms of legal framework supporting victims of violent crimes and particularly sex crimes, we are only just now beginning to put in place some very rudimentary infrastructure. There is certainly a system to allow victims to seek compensation for the crimes that have been committed against them from the state. But it would depend on what kind of crime has been committed, and currently, because the trial is still ongoing regarding the assailant, it's only once that process is finished that the victim would be able to engage that process. And often it's actually very traumatic for the victims because they have to relive the crime and go and testify and essentially go through all that sort of traumatic experience one more time. But not all sort of healing can be done through, obviously, monetary compensation. But currently, I think we do tend to lack somewhat the support, particularly the emotional and psychological support that can be provided to victims of these kind of crimes. I mean, we saw that, in this particular case, the victim actually wanted the identity of the assailant to be disclosed, and even that was denied to her.
We talked earlier about punishment, harsher punishment leading to perhaps deterring heinous crimes, which both Professor Hess and, of course, Professor Cho yourself disagreed with. That being said then, would education be a better option to deal with these assailants while in prison?
I mean, education is certainly one element that needs to be present as well. This disclosure of identity is also another sort of way that people argue is there to deal with it by naming and shaming these people. They're kind of being made as examples of what can happen to you if you commit this kind of crime. But the cases where identity has been disclosed is so minuscule that it doesn't have that same effect. For example, in Korea, every year there's about 225,000 violent crimes that are committed. And so in the last decade, since this new system came into place, there's been about 250,000 cases of serious crimes, including sexual crimes. But only in 34 cases has the identity of suspect been disclosed. So the problem at the moment is that we don't really have a definitive, certain and clear guideline as to when and how these identity of suspects should be disclosed. And so that's not what really needs to be addressed.
You're right, I see. More work needs to be done there then. Professor Hess, with regard to healing, what do you propose perhaps? We talked about how healing is a process, a collective process needed by both the victim's family, as well, the victim of course, and his or her family, as well as the family of the assailant. Could you tell us more about the support available for the families of assailants then?
It's interesting. That is very limited. In fact, they're sort of forgotten. Once they go to prison, they are oftentimes forgotten and they don't have a lot of resources depending on the prison that they go to. A lot don't even trust the services that are being provided in case they're being used in the trial. So they're really not getting a lot of resources that could be incredibly helpful for their healing. And we know that healing and collective healing is what is needed, not to be in a silo in a cell.
Right, like you mentioned earlier. All right, Professor Hess, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Cho here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends our Monday edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That would be Tuesday.